Okay, so here's a thought. What if something we've, believed for ages about our own past, something really central to human evolution, just isn't quite right? Today, we're diving into exactly that. We're looking at a really fascinating new study.
Mhm.
It's from researchers at Brown University, just out in Science Advances, and it basically throws a wrench into the idea that northern Africa dried out massively around 3 million years ago.
Right, and that specific drying event has always been linked pretty strongly to when the first early humans, our ancestors, started appearing.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack this new evidence. How did they even figure this out?
Hmm.
And importantly, what does it actually mean? For understanding ancient climates, yeah, but also maybe the story of us, of human
I
origins.
think it's pretty interesting, yeah.
It really does. So
Yeah.
let's maybe start with the old picture. What was the sort of standard story about Northern Africa's climate back then?
Well, for decades, the accepted view, the dominant theory, was that Northern Africa went through this major drying phase, right around 3 million years ago. And this timing, the Pliocene-Pleistocene boundary, it lines up with some big global stuff, like
Yeah.
the Northern Hemisphere cooling down, Greenland getting its permanent ice sheet.
Right, major climate shifts happening globally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And crucially, this time frame also seemed to match up perfectly with when we first see early hominids in the fossil record, the first species of
Yeah,
Homo.
or on genus. And the thinking was that this drying, it pushed our evolution somehow.
Yeah, that was the core idea.
Mhm.
The theory went that these drier conditions were a huge evolutionary pressure, like maybe forests shrank, grasslands opened up,
Forcing adaptations.
precisely, pushing early folks like Homo habilis, maybe Paranthropus, into totally new environments for foraging. And that pressure supposedly drove key changes, things like walking upright becoming more advantageous for covering ground, finding food in these new open landscapes.
Makes intuitive sense, I suppose. But what was the actual, physical evidence that made scientists think it was drying out so much back then? What were they actually measuring?
Ah, right. That came down to dust. Basically, dust. Earlier studies focused heavily on analyzing dust trapped in ocean sediment cores.
Taken from where?
These were collected off the coast of West Africa. And in those sediment layers, right around that critical time, 3.5 to 2.5 million years ago, they saw this really sharp spike, a big increase in dust blowing off the continent.
Okay, so more dust equals drier land. That was the interpretation.
That was exactly the interpretation. More dust blowing out to sea seemed like a clear signal. Deserts expanding, probably because the summer monsoons were getting weaker. It painted a pretty consistent picture of Africa drying out.
Until now. So this new study you mentioned, Bryce Mitsunaga led it. They looked at the same sediment cores.
The very same ones, yeah. But they used a totally different technique, a more, you could say, direct way to figure out past rainfall.
And what was that? What were they looking at instead of just the amount of dust?
They looked at leaf waxes, tiny bits of wax from the surfaces of leaves that washed or blew into the ocean and got preserved in those sediments.
Leaf waxes. How do they tell you about rain?
It's pretty clever, actually. So plants produce these waxes, right? And the chemical makeup of the wax, specifically the hydrogen isotopes in it, holds a signature of the water that plant absorbed.
Ah, okay. So it's like a little record of the water source.
Exactly. And here's the key bit. Rainwater has different types of hydrogen. There's regular light hydrogen, and then there's heavy hydrogen, deuterium, which is a neutron. The heavier water tends to rain out first.
Right.
So if you find leaf waxes with more of the light hydrogen, it means the plant was getting water from rain that had traveled further or lasted longer, basically. It indicates more sustained or frequent rainfall. Bryce Mitsunaga called it a direct signal of summer rainfall. It's like these tiny ancient rain gauges.
Wow, that's incredible detail. So they applied this leaf wax analysis to that Pliocene-Pleistocene boundary period.
Wow.
What did they find? Did it confirm the big drying trend?
Not at all. And this is the really groundbreaking part. The leaf wax data showed, well, basically no significant drying trend right across that boundary.
No drying trend. So the rainfall patterns were just stable.
Pretty much, yeah. The patterns of summer rainfall seemed largely stable on either side of that boundary. They didn't see the big shift that the dust suggested.
That completely changes the picture. So even while the rest of the world was going through these big climate shifts cooling, ice sheets growing, African rainfall, at least in that region, was holding steady.
That's what this evidence points to. It suggests those regional African rainfall patterns were surprisingly resilient, kind of decoupled from some of those major global climate trends happening at the time.
Okay, but then the dust. If it wasn't getting significantly drier, why was there that big spike in dust in the cores? What's the explanation now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The researchers suggest the dust increase must be down to something else. Not less rain, but maybe stronger winds or different wind patterns.
Ah, so the wind could just pick up more dust, even if the land wasn't necessarily turning into a desert.
Exactly. Stronger winds could mobilize more dust from the existing landscape. So the dust signal wasn't necessarily a signal of aridity, just more dust movement.
This really does complicate things, especially for the human evolution story. If our early ancestors weren't adapting to a suddenly drier world around that 3 million year mark, what does that do to those theories about why we started walking upright or why the genus Homo emerged then?
It fundamentally challenges that arid ancestry narrative, that whole idea that environmental pressure from drying was the main driver.
Hmm.
Well, if the drying wasn't happening in the way we thought, then the why behind those major evolutionary steps is suddenly much less clear.
It opens up the question again.
Completely. We need to look for other potential drivers, other environmental factors, or maybe internal biological developments. It forces a rethink.
Jim Russell, one of the senior authors, was quoted saying something about this, right?
Yeah, he put it very directly. He said, this calls for new research to determine when and why African climate and environments transition to a drier state and new theories to understand our ancestry. It basically sends scientists back to the drawing board on some key questions.
Wow. Okay, so it reshapes our view of the past. Does this study have any hints for the future? You mentioned the Pliocene-Pleistocene boundary period.
Yeah, there's a really interesting connection there. The study points out that CO2 levels back then, during that boundary period, are thought to be kind of similar to where we are today.
Similar CO2 levels? Really?
Roughly in the same ballpark, yeah. Though critically, the trend was opposite. CO2 was generally decreasing back then, whereas now it's rapidly increasing. But studying how the climate system, especially rainfall, behaved under those past CO2 conditions can give us valuable insights.
So it's like a natural experiment from the past that could inform today's climate models.
Exactly. It helps us understand climate sensitivity and regional responses, especially water cycles.
And Bryce Mitsunaga made that connection explicit, didn't he?
He did. He said something like, if we can see how global climate influenced what the water cycle is doing at that point in history, it could inform predictions of the future rainfall in this already water-stressed region.
So understanding rainfall patterns from millions of years ago could actually help predict future rainfall in places like North Africa today. That's quite a link.
It really is. It shows how studying Earth's deep past isn't just academic. It can have very real-world applications for understanding our present and future climate challenges.
So just to recap this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've seen how one new method, looking at these tiny leaf waxes, has seriously challenged a long-held scientific story about African climate and, by extension, about our own origins. It's a fantastic example of how science works, right? New tools, new data can lead to completely new interpretations.
Absolutely. It underscores how dynamic scientific understanding is.
Yeah.
You need these increasingly precise methods to really dig into the past. And it's amazing, isn't it, how something so small, chemical signature in a leaf wax, can force us to rethink such a big narrative about human evolution.
It really is. It makes you question everything, which I suppose is the point.
It's the core of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Keep questioning, keep refining the methods.
So it leaves us with some big questions to ponder, thinking about this new evidence. What other deeply ingrained scientific ideas might be due for a fresh look, maybe with new tech or different angles?
That's a great question.
And if it wasn't a big drying event pushing our ancestors forward back then, what else could it have been? What other forces might have shaped early human evolution? Lots to think about there. What really stands out to you from all this?